Question for you, Jeff. What and or where is Mesoamerica?
Mesoamerica is, well, I'm going to say that it's vaguely in sort of the central-ish America region, though it's not the same thing. If I remember correctly, I think I guess my idea of it's sort of the area that sort of wraps around the Yucatan Peninsula, right? So it goes a little bit farther south, Guatemala, Honduras, maybe even I don't think it goes all the way to Costa Rica, but maybe it starts getting a little bit over there, and then it also goes up into Mexico a little bit. Am I close here? Where am I heading?
You're totally more than close. I mean, that's pretty much it, right? So,
great.
Yeah, I mean, it overlaps with Central America is basically Belize, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica. And then Mesoamerica maybe includes Mexico or perhaps the southern part of Mexico, certainly the Yucatan Peninsula. So it's sort of the same as Central America. There's probably some contention on this, but that's basically where it is. And that's the region that we're going to be talking about today. Specifically, we're going to be talking about geography is Belize. Jeff, if you look on Google Maps, which I know sometimes you do, because I do that too, right? Because
all the time.
Right. If you look on Google Maps, most of the borders between countries are represented with a solid line. However, if you look at it and then you look at the border between Belize and Guatemala, it's represented with a dashed line or a dotted line. Why is that?
I mean, I don't know specifically. I'm not totally clued in on the history between these two countries. However, I do know that dashed lines on Google Maps typically are represented due to some sort of border dispute. So I'm going to hazard a guess here that Guatemala believes that some of Belize belongs to it, or vice versa, or maybe both at the same time. That's going to be my takeaway from that. I have no idea where the current standing is, though.
You are correct that there is a dispute on the border between Belize and Guatemala, and it's mostly Guatemala. It's contending part of Belize should be part of its territory. And did you know that up until the 90s, sometime in the 90s, most maps of the region made in Guatemala showed Belize as part of Guatemala?
Oh, wow. The entirety, the whole thing.
Pretty much.
The whole shebang.
Yeah.
Wow. No, so I didn't know that. So yeah.
I will answer the question as to why that is in the second part of the episode. That's a little bit of a teaser for what's coming up, but that's maybe a little known dispute. Of course, it's very known by people who live in the region, but we need to do some history and talk about a bunch of other things in order to get to that point. So let's start so we can at some point get to this very interesting question of where the border is between Guatemala and Belize.
I think it's absolutely fascinating. I think,
right?
If you look around Google Maps, you're going to find these sort of border shenanigans, for lack of a better word, all around, right? There's a lot of border disputes everywhere, right. Not everywhere, but a lot of different places. In fact, I think even up until recently, I think Canada had a little bit of a border dispute with like Denmark or something over an island. Anyways, it's just interesting to see these things and how they get represented on popular sort of map software, I guess Google Maps, maybe Apple Maps too, because it showcases something that I think it's a little hidden. It's not obvious that there's an issue there, but it is there.
This is definitely, I know we say this a lot, but this is an episode we need to do where we look at not all the border disputes, that would take too much time, but to look at border disputes. And as you pointed out, how they're represented on maps is really interesting and significant. And one of the reasons that Google Maps is representing these borders as dashed is because they want to acknowledge that so that people in both those countries will still use their product, right? Like if they showed a hard line with a particular definition that somebody doesn't agree with, then maybe somebody says, well, this isn't a legitimate map and doesn't want to do it. So there's probably commercial and political reasons for using something like that. So that's for the future. A couple pronunciation things here. Jeff, there is a C around the area there that can be pronounced in a couple different ways.
Are you talking about the Caribbean?
The Caribbean, yeah. But some people want to call it the Caribbean. So it can be pronounced in two different ways. My research suggests that Caribbean is maybe the preferred pronunciation.
Caribbean.
So, Right.
not
So the
Caribbean.
reason for that is because it's a reference to the Carib people of the areas, and they're not the Caribs, but the Caribs. So it's Caribbean. So think
Interesting. I didn't
care.
know that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, Caribbean, I think, is a very popular pronunciation in the United States. And I don't know this for sure, but my sense is it may have become popularized from a ride at Disneyland and Disney World called Pirates of the Caribbean. Right. Now, having made this caveat, I probably will say it both ways, but I'm going to try to say Caribbean because I think that's the preferred nomenclature, the preferred pronunciation. And then another term that we're going to use is Maya. So the Maya are people of indigenous to Central America, to Mesoamerica. And the word Mayan itself refers specifically to languages. And there are many different languages, Mayan languages that correspond with different ethnicities, Yucatec, Mopan, Quiche, Mam. There's probably 30 or more. But the term Maya itself refers to the people or to the culture. So I will try to use that correctly because I'm pointing it out. But anyways, a few vocabulary caveats before we get started. So listener, this would be a good time to break out your maps or your atlases of the Caribbean. Did I say? Yeah, I think I said that right. The Caribbean and Central America, so you can get a sense of what where we're talking about a little bit. With the caveat that maps are not always—they're never correct. Actually, they always lie in some ways, but there's some correctness to them. Belize is a country in Central America, and it is east and north of Guatemala and south of the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. Culturally, Belize is both Caribbean and Central American, and we'll get into a little bit why in just a bit. The primary languages there include English, Belizean Creole, Spanish, various Mayan languages, and Garifuna. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. Belize today has a population of about 416,000 people. So it's not a huge country. There's not a giant population, but over 400,000 people. Today, the largest ethnic group are mestizos, those of mixed Maya and Spanish heritage, which forms about half the population. So, and some of those individuals are from nearby countries, including Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And many of these migrants fled political violence and turmoil and sought safety in Belize. Particularly, I'm thinking of Guatemala, El Salvador, and to some degree Honduras as well. Earlier on, Mexico. Then there is the Creole people, which is people who are a mix of African and British heritage, which form about 25% of the population. Brazilian Creoles were the descendants of enslaved Africans and British loggers for the most part. And the Brazilian Creole language, it's one of many Creole languages, which means it's a mix, is an English-based language with influences from other Creole languages of the Caribbean and Central America, West African languages, Garifuna and Maya. So it's a very syncretic or mixed language. And when you hear it, if you speak English, at first you think you understand what they're saying because there's some English construction, English words. And then after a while, you realize, I'm not sure I'm 100% I'm getting all of this. So it right. Sounds like English, but different.
It's probably, I'm going to hazard a guess here. It's probably similar to the Jamaican sort of patois language that they speak, where if you do hear it, you can hear some variations of what would be English words because Jamaica was an English colony. But it's also at this point its own language.
That's right.
And therefore you're going to miss. You might pick up on a word or two here, but you're not capturing the meaning or intent behind what's actually being said.
Yeah, it's similar in some ways, as you pointed out, to the sort of Creole language spoken in Jamaica and influenced by that in some ways as well. Then there is the Maya people, which constitute about 11% of the population, mostly Yucatec, Quechua, and Mopan, but there are many other groups. And then there's the Garifuna, who make up a smaller percentage, about 8% of the population. Garifuna people of Belize descended from an Afro-Indigenous population from the island of St. Vincent. About 1675, the survivors of wrecked ships carrying enslaved people from Africa found refuge on St. Vincent. And the survivors started families with the indigenous Arawak and Kalinago people and subsequently formed a new culture. And these people became known as the Garifuna or the Black Caribs. So this is the Garifuna after fighting off European colonizers for over 100 years. The British eventually conquered the Black Caribs, or the Garifuna. The following year, the British forced over 5,000 Garifuna to move from St. Vincent to the island of Rautan, 40 miles north of Honduras. And then many eventually moved to mainland Honduras. And then in the 1830s, many migrated to Belize. So political conflict also led to another wave of migration in Honduras circa 1937. So today, in total throughout the world, there's about 400,000 people who identify as Garifuna, and most of them who live in Honduras or the United States. But Belize has a sizable population as well.
Yeah. It's interesting when you were running through the various countries and sort of the geopolitical issues they were having, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, even Mexico, right? It is interesting because I think, if you're a geographer or you're a historian or history fan, you're probably aware of some of the issues that these countries have had over the last, 100, 200 years, right? These are things that sort of bubble up here and there. So it's not surprising to hear about this. But I would say Belize has flown under the radar, where it's like, I don't think most people know what has happened here and to what extent their population is coming from due to these other issues. So it's just interesting hearing about all of this and how sort of Belize, how Belize has evolved, I guess.
And we're about to get into that. And you're right. It's a very fascinating and a little bit of a different story than some of the other countries that surround it. It stands out in certain ways, and we'll get into that because I think it's really interesting. But before we tackle some of that stuff, I wanted to ask you a question, broad bread and butter geography question. What is a toponym, Jeff?
A toponym? Isn't that just it's just a name we give to a place, right?
That's right. It's a place name. Right. So, we got to come up with these strange terms for things. Topo refers to the earth, and that's the name of a part of the earth. And we talk about these all the time. We use them all the time. And geographers sometimes pay pretty close attention to toponyms because they're not neutral pretty much ever. They're loaded with all kinds of history and particular histories. And so the origin of the name Belize, which is a toponym, is highly contested, for example. So I was able to read up about this a little bit. And there are several stories told about why the country is called Belize, but most of them fall on the side of legend, apparently. So one idea, and what's interesting is that you read a bunch of different sources, and some of them float some of these ideas as the default reason. Some suggest there's a conflict. And then I read a few academic pieces, which were kind of more recently published, which suggests that some of these are, in fact, probably myths. So one story is that there was an English pirate or buccaneer named Peter Wallace, who supposedly started a permanent settlement on the coast of what is now Belize. The story goes that the Spanish pronunciation of Wallace would be something like Belize, and that morphed into the word Belize. 21st century academic research suggests that Wallace never even existed and that he was a myth. And that there's a reason for that too. And it turns out that this is part of the English endeavor to sort of establish a claim to the territory of the area by this. And this has sort of worked its way into something that some people believe. In fact, many Europeans' maps from 1700s failed to even represent Belize at all. Like it just was like there's an empty space, basically. The Yucatan was often represented as an island. They didn't quite have it all figured out.
I mean, that's not surprising. If you look at historic maps of like basically anywhere in the quote unquote New World, the Europeans at the time, talented cartographers, but still obviously very limited in certain ways. I think I've seen some that depict Florida as a map, as an example, or as an island, for example.
In California as well, yeah.
In California as well, yeah. And so it's like, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Yucatan Peninsula, you see a peninsula, unless you know where it's actually connecting to, you see that there's water on all three sides. Well, this is an island. We'll just circle it around on the map, and that's probably true.
Yeah, and why it's significant is because this informs the geographic imagination of people. Obviously, the people who live there are cognizant of what's going on there and where they are. But for many people in the rest of the world, they rely upon maps or descriptions of maps to understand things. And so one of the things we can read into this is that the area that is now Belize there wasn't a whole lot of importance compared to some of the other neighboring areas placed on it by Spain and England in particular, who kind of vying for control of that area. So, and some early Spanish maps apparently label the area as depopulated, which when in fact indigenous people were very much present. So that also suggests an erasure of people and opening up for a future claim. But it's interesting to think that in the European cartographic and Anglo and Spanish history of Belize, that the cartography has been represented in many different ways, including this conflict that we talked about earlier with the dashed line between Guatemala and Belize. Another theory was that Belize was a variation of a Maya word for muddy river or muddy water. And a 2019 study suggests that the name is derived from a Yucatec Maya phrase for the road to Itza. And Itza refers to an area in the northern Yucatan Peninsula. So that is some of the latest research I've found out, but that may be the case. But there it is. It's a complicated history that has been debated for a while.
I think this is so interesting because there are a few places out there where the origin of the name of the place is sort of just lost to history. And the one that immediately springs to my mind is where we live here currently in Oregon, right? Oregon is one of the few states where they don't actually know where Oregon's name came from. And they have some theories out there, but it's generally thought to have been lost to history, and we just call it Oregon now. And it's like, well, why is that? It's like, well,
yeah. I mean, I think there was some research done at the University of Oregon that suggests that it did derive in some way from some Native American terminology. But yeah, it's amazing that not much time can go by and you forget why something was named. So for example, in Portland, to give you another example, we have what's sometimes called the Alphabet District because the streets are named A, B, C, D, with names after that. And I did some extensive research on that a few years ago and found that some of the street names, which were named probably 100 years ago or maybe 120 years ago, they don't know. They're not sure which Vaughn Street is named after, for example. It's incredible that we can lose track of history so quickly. And in some ways, we'll never be sure sometimes. We'll just have some strong ideas about what happened. So that's the nature of toponyms in a lot of ways. So let's go way back for a little bit because we'd like to do that. I think that's really important in most cases, and certainly in this case for understanding what's going on in Belize. And we're going to talk about the ancient Maya civilization, which was not just in Belize, but in the Yucatan Peninsula, Guatemala, and then the western parts of Honduras and El Salvador as well. There seems to be, in the popular imagination, I remember kind of learning this as a kid, that the Maya mysteriously disappeared, that there was a collapse of the society and that the people disappeared. And that's just not true. I mean, there was a collapse in the society, and that was before Europeans arrived, but there's over 8 million Maya who live in Central America today. So the idea that this is a group of people that has vanished is not correct. There's over 30 Mayan languages which developed from ancient times, which endure today. And many of these languages are not mutually intelligible, which I think is important to note as well. If we want to go way back, we can go back 4,000 years or maybe even several thousand years earlier, and we have what we might call the proto-Maya people. So people who became the Maya people settled there. The Maya civilization emerged in those regions, in the areas that I talked about. And there's some research that was done in 2022 or published in 2022 that suggests that the ancestors of the Maya migrated from as far south as present-day Colombia, but maybe further north. So there's a group of people there from Colombia up until the middle part of Central America that it's believed that people migrated from there and became Maya. As they settled, the Proto-Maya people learned to cultivate maize or corn as a staple crop, which is extremely important to their society. There are symbols for corn that are conflated with just life itself in the hieroglyphics of the Maya civilization. Subsequently, Maya people cultivated, among other crops, squash, cassava, chili peppers, and beans. So these are foods that we still associate and crops we still associate with that area today. Maya refers to various groups of people. So in ancient times and even more recently, these people didn't consider themselves to necessarily be culturally or politically unified. I think people today may identify that way to a certain degree, but generally people are identifying by more specific ethnicities, which are characterized by particular languages as well. So there was probably some separation for a while, and these different languages form.
Right. I mean, you see this. This is something that you can see within, bringing it into a U.S. or a Canadian context within the tribes, sort of in our area as well, right? Yeah. The Algonquin speaking peoples. There's hundreds or thousands of different tribes that are part of that. They all just had a common language. Or I think even the Iroquois Confederacy is like 7 different tribes. There's probably differences there. They just happen to have a combined language structure or something like that. And it's funny how when you go back far enough, we talk about borders and nations and countries and all these kinds of things. When you go back far enough, it's like, no, the binding factor, even though they might not always agree, and sometimes they even war with each other, but the binding factor is the language. And it always seems to come back to that.
Yeah, and that's the way we characterize it today as well. We might say a Chinook-speaking people or something like that, suggesting that these languages are somehow connected. But it's not sort of the political identity that characterizes the world today. The modern state system we've talked about before on the show that basically originated in Europe is something that's sort of exported to different parts of the world. It's not that people didn't have identity, but they were dissimilar from the ones that we think about today as default identities. Maya peoples have migrated to what is now Belize circa or before 2600 BCE. So I think that's when I was first learning about the Maya, decades ago. The estimates I read were more recent, but as more research has been done and more deciphering of, archaeological finds has been done, they've sort of predated that. And so they've realized that this is a group of people who have been around for quite a long time. Evidence suggests that the oldest Maya site was Coelho in northern Belize. So that as far as researchers know, that one of the first Maya places was in fact in Belize. And so if we move ahead to what's sometimes called the pre-classic or Olmec period, this is like 1500 to 200 BCE. And this is because the Maya developed in very close proximity to a number of other civilizations, including the Olmec. And the Olmec is the oldest known people and culture in Mesoamerica. Doesn't mean that there wasn't one before, but that's, as far as we know, that was the one that on the historical record now is the oldest. And the Maya, like the Olmec, built large cities that had very important religious and ritual significance. Notable is the construction of pyramid temples. Many of these ruins of these temples and cities can be visited today, and excavation continues. And some of these temples may have been into the classic period as well. Maya innovated agriculture, irrigation, trade networks, writing, and a complex calendar. And the ancient Maya are known for their advanced knowledge of astronomy and mathematics in particular. So they
have the very famous calendar, right?
Yep.
That was the one that I guess it ended maybe potentially in 2012, and everybody was, had a little bit of a freak out over it. What's going to happen in 2012? I think it was like December 2012. And of course, nothing did. But I think there's a whole movie about it too, which was funny.
Yeah, no, I'm sure there was. And we could dig deeper into that. I think part of it is, or a lot of it is misinterpreting the calendar itself by contemporary researchers. Yeah. And then also misinterpreting what the significance of that year was, that maybe the future was predicted in that time. And so the idea was, well, this is probably going to end now. They haven't recorded anything. They didn't see anything else coming. Let's do this. Let's take a quick break and we'll come back and we'll get more into Belize and we'll restart with some more about the Maya in just a few minutes.
All right. We will be right back.
And we're back. It's the Geography is Everything podcast. We're talking about geography as Belize, and we are talking about the ancient Maya, so we can talk about the contemporary Maya as well. The classic period starts around 200 to about 900 Common Era, and this is sometimes referred to as the peak of the Mayan civilization. What does that mean when somebody says the peak of civilization? It's kind of a curious phrase.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's
It's
a
kind
part
of a
of me that wants
disturbance to everybody else of every other generation, right? Yeah.
right. There's a part of me that wants to suggest that it's the height of the economic. They're the wealthiest, they have the most whatever. But I think when you get back into some of these ancient cultures, one, the economy is just vastly different from what we
Mhm.
have today. These ideas that we have today for like, the US being the economic power of the world doesn't translate back to the ancient Mayan culture. So maybe it's like when the population was the highest, when they had the most claimed territory, although even claiming territory is different back then. I don't know. It's a good question. It's a good thought
And
process.
yeah, and I think it's an open question, probably. I think in this particular case, Maya civilization is referred to a period of time when cities and agriculture were the most developed, as you suggested, where there was probably a high population as well. And it also probably refers to some of those advancements related to architecture, astronomy, and mathematics that we just discussed. And it's important to indicate that the Maya religion was also very centrally important to the functioning of cities at this time. I don't want to say religion is unimportant at other times, but it's sort of very markedly hierarchical and very connected to the ways in which cities were constructed and built. And there's probably an economic expression to this, some trade as well, but it's not believed that there was a Mayan empire per se, but rather more a series of what we might call city states or something like that,
Hmm.
who may sometimes been in conflict, but many times were trading with one another. Something that's distinct from this period, maybe from earlier as well, I wanted to raise because we're both people who are studying geography of sport at times, you and I.
Yeah, we do.
And there's a team ball sport that arose from the Maya culture with very important political, religious, and social dimensions. And have you heard of this game before? Do you know anything about this?
I have. I don't know if it's this exact one. I've seen variations of what would be broadly described as ancient sort of indigenous ball games from South or Central America, where I think there's variations of it, but I've seen one. I think it was in like an old Disney movie, but it's like they have to hit the ball with their hips through like a hoop or something that's on the side. I don't know, something like that. I can see the popular imagination of it, I guess.
Yeah, the Disney may have captured something correct in that case. But there was a ball game that sort of resembled soccer. In that you couldn't use your hands, but you couldn't use your feet either. So,
Hmm.
as you suggested, you had to use your hips, heads, shoulders, and knees in order to propel the ball. And there would be some kind of hoop for the ball to go through, sometimes at a pretty high height. The ball would sort of bounce around it, but it was heavy enough and sort of dangerous enough that they had to wear protection. So they had to
Right.
wear, the equivalent of protective equipment today to protect different parts of their bodies. Apparently, neighboring cities would compete with one another, and the game was sometimes used to settle disputes. Whether this was used in place of war or not is not entirely clear to me. Some scholars might have a pretty strong idea about that, but that's out there. And the game also figures very prominently in the Quiche Maya narrative of creation, which is called the Popol Vuh. And in this case, it's the sun and the moon gods, I believe, that are competing in this competition. So it's a very sort of strong part of their cosmology and their religion as well. Now, so for many years, researchers from the western part of the world believed that the losing team or the losing team captain were sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes subsequently sacrificed to the gods. And then it came up that it may have been the winning team or winning captain that was sacrificed.
Hmm.
Um, and so, this sounds alarming to us because we have a different sort of configuration of life based on the religions that predominate in the world today. So there were religious rituals that had human sacrifices among the Maya, but the Maya, to their understanding, was that there was not real life was cyclical. There wasn't sort of life and death as that we would recognize it, for example, in Christianity or in Islam, which there's this world and then there's the next world, and they're very different and they're distinct. The Maya apparently believed that the things were a bit more cyclical. So in other words, if somebody stopped living, they weren't dead because their spirit would move on into another form or something like that.
Right.
And so this might help us wrap our heads a little bit around why they would do something like this, because they have a very different conceptualization of life in the world over time than major religions do today.
No, that's fascinating. I think, to me, that sounds, I don't know where this idea came from originally, maybe India, but the idea of reincarnation, right? You're once you die, you're just going back into sort of the system, as it were.
Yeah.
And I think that does reframe sort of what death is for a culture, especially if it's a culture of everybody, right? It's, if your grandmother dies, you're not necessarily all that sad because your belief system just says, well, she'll be back again.
In the case of the Hindu religion, there is this idea of reincarnation, which also is very convenient for supporting the very rigid caste system that existed there as well. Again, it's a different configuration of the world and allows people to see things in a different way. And
right.
So let's move on with the Maya just a little bit here. The Maya civilization is thought to have started to decline between the 8th and 10th centuries. And so again, what does decline mean? We talked about what peak means. Decline, in this case, it probably means decreased trade, increased warfare, an increased death rate. And eventually this also led to the abandonment of some of these cities that had tens of thousands of people in them. So the abandonment of cities, and it's speculated that many Maya cities were abandoned within about a 100-year period. So it all happened pretty quickly. Of course, this is also where this myth of the disappearance or the vanishing of the Maya come from. And it was more that the civilization sort of moved away from those large cities and people started living, I think, in smaller settlements again. There's, I think, predominant theory that there's a combination of deforestation and drought, which maybe have related in some ways to climate change at the time, but also human activity that catalyzed this decline. There are probably other factors at play too. So you're moving away from the hierarchy of the city and things sort of take a turn at that point. And of course, the architecture of the ancient Maya civilization is evident today in some of these temples and cities that are being excavated in Belize. This includes Altun Ha, Caracol, and Shenantonich. And I've been to Shenantonich, which is a very fascinating place. I was fortunate enough to visit Mayan ruins in Guatemala and Belize and Honduras. And it was very interesting to visit them and see how they're sort of excavated and administered and talked about in different ways in different countries. So in any ways, by the time the Spanish conquistadors show up on the scene, the Maya cities had long been abandoned, but of course the people were still there.
It's what you're saying seems like a moment where people will be like, whoa, how could people just abandon these big cities? That seems so insane. It seems like you would want to stick around. Everything's already built, XYZ. And I think it's worth calling out that, after the Roman Empire fell, Rome was practically abandoned compared to its height. I think they dropped down to just a few thousand people at one point, or maybe a few tens of thousands of people, but that was down from, hundreds of thousands or millions of people at sort of the height of the Roman Empire. And it's like, yeah, this can happen. There's no longer a something pulling everybody in, an economy, a wealth, a power base that's pulling everybody in. And when that doesn't exist anymore, people will scatter and they'll try and find something else.
To have cities, you have to have pretty significant agriculture. Right? I mean, you can have small cities maybe without agriculture, but generally throughout the world, cities have arisen with agriculture. And if that system breaks down in some way and isn't able to support that kind of urban population, then people start to subsist in a different way, which may be in smaller groups. And there's examples of abandoned stuff all over the world, right? Like even from our own culture. I mean, on my Instagram feed, I have this abandoned buildings kind of vibe going on. And there are things that were built in the 20th century that have been completely abandoned. Sometimes it's entire cities. So this isn't maybe as rare as we might think it is, but it is fascinating to consider why this happened. So I managed Spanish conquistadors. So it's time to filter in European contact here, because that's going to change things very significantly, as it has in many parts of the world.
It always does.
It always does. And, it's not always It's a story that ends up badly oftentimes for the people who are already living in some of these places. England, or subsequently Britain, France, the Netherlands, Portugal, and Spain all sought to exploit resources in Central America and the Caribbean. In the early 1500s, Spanish conquistadors began to conquer Maya lands and claim much of the territory for Spain. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Spanish sailors and missionaries began to occupy the Maya lands that are now known as Belize. However, it seems that permanent colonial settlement in what is now Belize was not made until maybe the 1700s. This is a question of dispute, but there's a lot of speculation that a lot of the claims that there was settlement earlier, particularly on the part of the English, was to establish territorial claims, and that the history of Europeans, for example, English logging, and which was a big industry at one point in the 1700s in Belize, really doesn't go back as far as maybe it's sometimes represented to have gone back.
Interesting.
So you get a situation where Spain has claimed a lot of territory in the area, and then English pirates or buccaneers are in the area there, and they're trying to establish things. And piracy becomes kind of a big thing by the middle of the 1500s. And a note on piracy: you probably know that pirates, what we think of as pirates, used to be sponsored by different countries, which is why some pirates that are English have "Sir" in front of their names. That's not something that you would think of for just like a freelance pirate, right? So the idea was that they were supported, and the English would support pirates taking over Spanish ships and vice versa. And then at one point there was an agreement among European powers to not do that. It's like, let's not do this to each other anymore. I think it would be better for everybody. And then the pirates start thinking, well, they're out of a job. So they become completely independent contractors, and they just start doing the same things, but on their own behalf. And so what used to be a state enterprise becomes an independent enterprise, which is how we mostly think about pirates, probably particularly in that ride that we mentioned earlier at Disney World.
Right. Or all the movies that came afterwards.
And every movie that's come after that. So perhaps at some point, these English buccaneers started using the Keys, and Keys are islands off the mainland coast of Belize and Mexico, as a base of operations for some of their activities. And then at some point, and when exactly is not clear, some British individuals start to excavate hardwood. The Spanish were doing that too, and there was piracy of those ships. And at some point, the English were like, let's just cut out the Spanish part and just go and start excavating some of this stuff ourselves. And that was by the 1700s. How much earlier, it's unclear. So we have a period of a few hundred years where Britain and Spain are really contesting the area that is now Belize. And during this time, many remote Maya villages existed without too much interference from European powers. And that would change, but for a while, that was the situation.
It's really interesting thinking about this contest between England and Spain at the time. I mean, listener, if you're unaware of sort of the Spanish colonial empire at the time, it was heavily centered on what is today Mexico City, or the former ruins of the Aztec Empire. And that's sort of where they established themselves and started growing out. And that's where eventually they would, there was a whole other thing in South America, but it was always going to be administered by, I believe it's called the Viceroyalty of Spain. Correct. Or Viceroyalty of New Spain, that was centered in Mexico City. And so it's kind of amazing to think that they were able to dominate, quote unquote, so much of Central, even into North America, Central America, and South America. And yet they couldn't sort of, I guess, deal with the English in this relatively small area that was pretty close relative to where their administrative center was.
Absolutely. Yeah, and the English had a big administrative colonial center in Jamaica, which isn't that far apart either.
That's true. That's a good point.
And the fact that we talked about earlier that Belize is like absent from some early maps suggests that other places were capturing the attention of these colonial powers more than what became Belize. But eventually, of course, that shifts. So in the context of this contention between Spain and Britain, in 1763 and 1783, there are some treaties that are signed which grant British subjects authority to do logging there, but in doing so, that sort of reifies the Spanish claim for sovereignty there, that if you're given permission, that means that you have to ask for permission. However, in 1798, Spain, they had made several incursions and kicked out British loggers, and they tried to do that in 1798, and that ended up not working out. So at that point, England has a stronger claim on what's going on. And after this, Belize, what is now Belize, becomes a de facto British colony. And in 1862, it becomes a formal colony known as British Honduras. And this was the name up until recently, in fact. And Honduras, there's, of course, is a country nearby, but it references the Bay or the Gulf of Honduras, which is directly to the east of Belize and to the north of Honduras. In 1859, and this will be important for this border dispute, Britain and Guatemala signed a treaty which demarcates the border between Belize and Guatemala. So it wasn't an independent country of Belize that was signing it. It was Britain and Guatemala. And in 1862, Britain declares the settlement of Belize to be a crown colony. I mentioned that. And the lieutenant governor reported to the governor of Jamaica, and that sort of centralized control that we were talking about. And then in 1893, Mexico renounced a claim they previously had on Belize, which is why they're not really currently involved in a border dispute in the region today.
It's interesting because granted, Belize is not a British colony anymore, but it's interesting if Guatemala had signed this, whatever treaty with Britain that demarcated sort of what was British Honduras or Belize today and Guatemala at the time. What's happened since then where Guatemala is whoa, that maybe they're like, that was with Britain, that wasn't with Belize. And so,
right. That could be part of it. There may have been different maps made that showed different borders. Mm-hmm. And there's probably answers to a lot of these things that I don't have, but that's interesting. It would be interesting to go deeper into and find out the nature of that particular conflict and what sort of how countries how they claim legitimacy for their claims.
Right. I mean, like you said earlier, this is a future episode. Absolutely. We got to do it.
Yeah, we're going to write this down. Yeah. All right. Let's get to the 20th century, Belize. But before we do that, we have to take a short break. Welcome back. It's the Geography is Everything podcast with Jeff and Hunter, and we're talking about geography as Belize. We're talking about 20th century Belize, and that in 1954, Belize starts to gain limited autonomy from Britain. So they're still part of Britain, the United Kingdom, but they have some autonomy. A couple big events that I'll mention here, 1931 and 1961, hurricanes completely decimate, or not completely, but largely decimate Belize City, which is on the coast, which was the capital of the country at the time. And partly in response to these hurricanes that did so much damage to Belize City in 1970, the capital was moved. Now, they didn't physically move all the buildings, but a different city became the capital, and that's Belmopan, which is about 50 miles west of Belize City, and that's inland. So 1964, a new constitution grants Belize full autonomy, establishes a two-chamber parliament, and allows for universal adult suffrage. And then in 1973, the country's name changed from British Honduras to Belize. So I'm going to say that's sort of recently, 73.
Yeah, that seems very recent. Yeah.
Right.
In fact, when you started talking about British Honduras, I was thinking, oh yeah, I've seen maps that have British Honduras on them, right? It didn't seem, and those maps were old, but they didn't seem like they weren't ancient. It was like the Soviet Union was on them, that kind of stuff.
Right. From the early 70s, maps might use this toponym for the place. And so in 1981, Belize becomes independent. So that's very recently, right? So in a sense, it's one of the more recent countries in the world. There's obviously some that are more recent, South Sudan and others. However, in 1981, Belize becomes independent. Most countries recognize it, but one country does not, and it might not shock you to learn that Guatemala refuses to recognize Belize's independence. And so
to this day.
What's that?
To this day?
Not sort of. Here,
Okay,
Let
let's
me
get to
spell
it.
this out. British troops apparently stayed behind a little bit to help protect the border. And in 1992, Guatemala recognized Belize's independence, but maintained some claim to the territory. So it wasn't until 92 that they say, all right, you're an independent country, but we don't agree where this border is. And so that's sort of the more contemporary side of things. I was in Guatemala and Belize and Honduras in 1994. So that was really it was just a couple of years or less after this recognition. And I'd spent most of my time in Guatemala. So a lot of what I was learning about Belize was from the perspective of people in Guatemala. Between 2002 and 2003, Belize and Guatemala negotiated an agreement regarding the border dispute. However, a Guatemalan referendum rejected the settlement, so it didn't go into effect. And then in 2000, the border dispute between Belize and Guatemala continues to this day under the arbitration of the International Court of Justice. So that has not been completely been resolved. And then Belize remains part of the Commonwealth, sort of like Canada and
Right.
Australia, New Zealand, which means that King Charles III is the monarch and head of state of Belize, but domestically it has in place a governor general that really there's a lot of interest in Belize today because it's a beautiful place in the Caribbean. Yeah.
It's a tourist hotspot. I mean, last week we had an entire episode about people's summer vacations, and Belize is absolutely going to be a place that people visit this summer. I mean, it's becoming very well known as a place to go, for resorts, to get the beach, the Caribbean, Central American lifestyle. I don't know if they have jungles down there. I'm sure they do because I know Guatemala does. But all that's to say is, a very big part of
absolutely. But apparently, it's an even more popular spot for your winter vacation because the majority, it's like some maybe on the order of 70% of the tourists to Belize are from the United States, and the United States, our winter is December through, March or something like that or thereabouts. And so apparently December, February, and March are the biggest tourist months overall there. But people are visiting there, of course, all year round because people are attracted to that kind of environment and that kind of experience all year round. And one of the other big draws to Belize is actually off the coast of Belize, and it's the Belize Barrier Reef, which is the largest reef in North America, in the Northern Hemisphere, and the second largest reef in the world, and the largest one being the Great Barrier Reef off the northeast coast of Australia. So in 1996, the Belize Barrier Reef Reserve System was designated by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site and recognized for its biodiversity, its cultural significance, and its environmental vulnerability as well. And it consists of 7 discrete protected areas. One of these is the Blue Hole Natural Monument. Have you ever heard of this thing before?
I have never heard of the Blue Hole Natural Monument.
Natural Monument, yeah.
I've never heard of that, no.
This is a large marine sinkhole, which is about 1,000 feet across and over 400 feet deep, located near the center of Lighthouse Reef Atoll, 50 miles from mainland Belize. And it attracts scuba divers from around the world, very advanced dives, apparently. And what's distinctive about it is that there's this dark blue area of the sea that it stands out and very strong, and it's circular and strong, contrast to the lighter waters around it. And this is something that you can see images of. It's pretty fascinating. And apparently it's distinct enough where you can see it from space. Not having been to space, I can't confirm this for you, but I'm told that you can see this from space. There's some satellite images that might depict that for us. And there is an interconnected expanse of underwater caverns that used to be above the surface of the water that are associated with the Blue Hole. And it's the largest natural formation of its kind in the world. So this is something that's very distinct and Belize sometimes gets represented with this sometimes as well. Back to the just overall reef system. In 2009, the reef system was added to the list of World Heritage Sites in Danger. So there's a specific list of World Heritage Sites that are seen as being endangered. However, in 2018, the reef system was removed from that list, And this was 5 months after the Belizean government established a moratorium on oil exploration and drilling in Belize's offshore waters. And in 2008, when this legislation was passed, Belize was one of 3 countries in the world with this kind of legislation. So it's seen as sort of very forward-thinking and a way to preserve culture, livelihood, environmental integrity. So that's still, I think, a pretty distinct situation throughout the world.
It's interesting. I would be curious to know, when I think about these kinds of switches, let's pass this thing to, save this whatever forest, reef, whatever natural thing. There's always a part of me, maybe it's a cynical part of me. It's like, well, that's great, and I love that. But are they doing it just because now they're trying to protect their tourism dollars? Is and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's like, well, if they didn't have tourism, would they still be just drilling and trying to find all the money they can get? And it's like, maybe. I don't know.
That's a great question, and maybe not, right? I mean, it would be easy to think that if there wasn't this really important industry located there, tourism, that they would be open to other industries that might be important there. But in fact, it's probably a combination of different reasons, and sometimes politics makes strange bedfellows kind of thing, and people are like, all right, well, this is what the result we want. Maybe it's for different reasons, but let's try to make this happen. And I'm sure it was a fight because, oil is a huge industry that can bring lots of money into the coffers of a country, and many countries are not successful in having this kind of legislation.
Right.
It does turn out that half the Belize population depend on the barrier reef area for their livelihoods, and most are related to tourism. There's some other industries that are maybe tangential to tourism as well. And it's really the Keys in Belize that attract the most tourists. So some people fly into Belize City, but very few people visit Belmopan, for example, which is a very small city in a very hot and humid climate. In 2019, for example, which is the year before the pandemic, over 500,000 people visited Belize. Now, remember, there's just over 400,000 people who live there. So they had more than their own population visit that country within the span of 2019. Now, the rate of tourism, the number of tourists plummeted during COVID. And last year, the number of tourists was close, but did not quite reach that level from 2019. So I suspect that maybe this year or next year, they'll be back to having 500,000 people visit every year. Beginning in 1991, cruise ships began anchoring in the waters off of Belize, also increased the number of tourists. The largest island of Belize is Ambergris Caye, which is also the number 1 tourist destination in all of Belize. And in Spanish, it was sometimes called Isla Bonita. So I have to say that for any Madonna fans listening out there, that this island is rumored to have inspired Madonna's 1986 hit La Isla Bonita, which is probably not true, it turns out. Because I think there's some interviews with Madonna. She's like, well, this is just sort of a place, imaginary place. However, the song at the very beginning refers to San Pedro, if you recall the lyrics, which is a town on the south of the island of Ambergris Caye. So that gave more power. And then it also allows, I think, Belize and Ambergris Caye to say, hey, this is the place Madonna was singing about in that song. Madonna incidentally co-wrote that song with her producer. And just a little last tidbit that I can't resist, the song was originally shopped to Michael Jackson, who decided that it wasn't the right song for him. So Madonna recorded it herself.
Fascinating. Huh.
Yeah.
Interesting.
There's another big tourist attraction there called Caye Caulker, which is a much smaller island. It's 5 miles long and less than a mile wide. And it's been very popular for decades with the sort of budget backpacker set, which, I went to Ambergris for a day and didn't stay overnight. And I stayed for several days in Caye Caulker because that was my budget as well.
Right.
Again, mainland Belize attracts tourists, but less than the Keys. And I did have an experience in Belmopan. I was there for, I think it was 10 days or 2 weeks or something with 3 of my friends in the mid 90s. And we built a water catchment tank. We helped under the leadership from, I think it was El Salvador. And so we built this for the Red Cross so they could collect water. And it was in October and it was brutally hot, very humid. And then like 3 or 4 times a day, this guy would just open up and just pour lots of rain, and for like 20 minutes, and then we'd have to go back to work. So that's some of my, I have a lot of memories of this place. It's in a fantastically beautiful country, wonderful people with the kind of diversity that we talked about earlier in the episode. So it's a place to consider on your map of the world. Of course, tourism is something that we've had an ongoing debate about. It's a great thing because it gets people to be engaged with and care about different parts of the world. There's a sort of a very big dark side to tourism as well. So we'll leave that to individual listeners to decide where they want to travel to. But that's what we have time for today when talking about Belize.
It's been a really fun episode exploring Belize. I like it when we take a place and we just sort of dive into it a little bit, because every place has a story, and obviously every place is geography, right? There's a geography to every place. There's a reason why those places exist. There's a reason why the humans that are there exist there today and where they came from. There's just so much we can do when we just talk about a place, such as we've done with Hawaii, Alaska, Greenland, Easter Island. We did that a few weeks ago.
Right. That's right.
They always make for fascinating, I think, episodes that people can really enjoy, and it gives people sort of a finite area to just hone in on. Like, okay, we're going to talk about this, and I know where we're talking about.
It's probably what people expect when we talk about geography, right? They're like, oh, we're going to talk about this place. And
exactly,
as we've suggested throughout our tenure on our podcast, that geography is many things, but it remains place-based in many ways too.
Absolutely. Well, with that, Hunter, where can people find you around the world, the internets maybe?
Well, I am Hunter Shobi. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University, and there are some tactile ways in which you can see my work. They're called books. There are cultural atlases. One of them is called Portlandist, a cultural atlas. The other one is called Upper Left Cities, an cultural atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle. Those are co-authored by David Banis with contributions by you, Jeff, my co-host of Geography is Everything.
Yeah, my name is Jeff Gibson. I am the co-host of this podcast, Geography is Everything. You can also find me over on YouTube. That's youtube.com/geography by Jeff. If you want this podcast delivered straight to your email, just go over to Substack. That's geographyiseverything.substack.com, and you can subscribe there. It's totally free. If you liked what you either watched today or listened to today, please either like and subscribe on YouTube or rate and review us on any of the podcast apps that exist out there. Those are always really fun to see and read. And I don't know if they really help with the algorithmic ranking, so I just think it's kind of nice for you to be able to share your thoughts about what we're doing. I don't know. I think it helps people, whether they want to partake, whether they want to join in.
Right. It's nice to hear. Yeah.
It's nice to hear. Yeah. Next week, we're going somewhere very different, much colder, not nearly as tropical, but should be very interesting. We're going to the moon.
Oh, wow. Yeah, geography references the Earth, but I think we can let it go. There are spatial things to talk about when we're talking about the moon that relate to the moon and relate to Earth. So I think that's going to be super fascinating.
It's going to be really interesting. We're going to cover sort of how the moon became the moon in the first place. We're going to cover the culture of that place that people have with the moon, the ideas, the religions that formed around it. We're going to talk a little bit. We're going to do a little bit of a callback to our episodes on the space race. Why do we care about the moon? Why are we trying to get there? Right? There's a lot that goes into that. But there's also this aspect of the moon in that it influences so much of our planet, right? There's an inherent geography to the way that our planet works because the moon is the moon and it's there. And so we're going to talk about that as well. This is also going to be our second episode where we're going to have another guest on to help us talk a little bit more about the astronomy, sciencey aspects of the moon. That's, again, we don't really have the expertise for it. I am not an astronomer.
No. I took some astronomy classes, which I'm grateful for, but that was a long time ago now. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to that. We'll introduce that guest on next week's episode. Obviously, that episode will then come a couple of days afterwards, like we did with Jesse Alexander when we did the World War I episodes. But I guess until then, we will see you around the internet, maybe. Go check out our stuff. You see us around there.
Thanks for listening.